Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. In today's episode, I speak with my ex-husband and father of our children. Together we reflect on the 11 years since the death of our younger twin daughter Amaya. In doing this, we are spending time speaking about her, honoring her place in our lives, and, as I'd like to see it, spend time parenting her. Our conversation was moving and opened my eyes to parts of Chris's grief that I wasn't aware of. Chris says the following about his personal experience of grief.
It's a constant thing, it never goes away, and it often pops up in little moments, sometimes catches you unexpectedly, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I wasn't thinking about this, and here it is. So yeah, and I think that'll happen all my life. There's going to be all sorts of key moments in Ananda Mae's life where I'll be wondering, what would it have been like, the two of them, and what would Amaya have been like? How would she have been? And, I think that's natural.
I, Natalie, cannot say this often enough. I think that's so important for people to understand, that this is not something that goes away. It's just like my mother. She will always be my mother, and there's key moments that I miss her more, and then key moments where it's less present, but she's not going to go away because she's dead, or that part of her not being here present physically is a topic, the same way as for me, for you, for Ananda Mae, it's a topic that her sister is not growing up with her. About this week's guest. Chris and Natalie are the parents of Ananda Mae and Amaya, twin girls who do not grow up with each other. The parents do their best at raising one here on earth and the other in the beyond, wherever that is. Topics discussed in this episode. First of all, we share what we both remember individually of our story of loss and trauma. Then we share the differences in grieving and how we each dealt with our grief. We also talk about the ongoing grief and what it looks like 11 years later. We also share how we parent the non-physical child and how Ananda Mae is dealing with her siblings' grief. I do hope you enjoyed the episodes in Season 1 and that you join in again in Season 2, which will start up again in a couple of weeks. Can I ask you for a favor? Please rate and review the podcast How to Deal with Your Grief and Trauma, so that many more people can benefit from listening to it. Thank you so much. I really hope that you enjoy today's special episode. Welcome, Chris. It's so nice to see you, and thank you for taking the time to doing this special episode of the podcast today with me. How are you today?
I'm fine, Natalie. Thank you. Thank you for doing this together with me.
So we're doing this special episode today as a way to remember our story and our loss. And Amaya, our daughter, our younger twin daughter, has died 11 years ago today. And so it's a special day for both of us. And it's the first time that we're taking time together to reflect on that time. So why don't we start with you starting to share what do you remember of our story of loss and trauma?
Oh, wow. It's a bit hard to know where to start. For me, I guess it starts initially with the joy and expectation of becoming pregnant with twin girls. And obviously there was a lot of excitement and build up around that. And then there was the shock of initially being told that there was a problem in the development of the twins, and that one or possibly both of the girls might not develop properly or might not survive. And that led into a very difficult and stressful time during the pregnancy, where obviously on the one hand we were trying to focus on making the pregnancy as comfortable and healthy for everyone involved as possible. And on the other hand, always worrying, what did it mean? Would the girls be okay? And so, it was a long process, which, went over many months leading up to the birth. And even at the time of the birth, although, we knew, and I knew, that there was a very high chance that at least one of the girls, Ananda Mae or Amaya, might not survive, there was still hope that, that they both would, and particularly that Amaya would actually be okay. And a lot of the time around the birth, I mean, I have fragments of memories of the time. You know, it was very intense and I think very stressful, and there was a lot going on. And I have fragments. I mean, I remember the actual birth of the two girls, you know, being in the operating room or the theater, and music playing and holding your hand as the girls were being born. And then, you know, there was just this very intense period where we had the two girls in the ICU, and, you know, that's an incredibly stressful and overwhelming experience. I mean, on top of becoming a first-time parent, you know, having all of the fear about were the girls okay, and then being bombarded with all of the sights and sounds of the ICU, which is an incredibly stressful environment. You know, I remember seeing the two girls lying in these humidity cribs, and I have to admit that the whole period is fragmented. It's like I experience it, when I think back, I experience it as like a sequence of fragments. I think the you know, it's hard to put it all together into context. And I remember being in this very torn state. On the one hand, you know, feeling joy about the fact that we, you know, that we had the girls, and that one of them, you know, was seemed to be well and doing okay in the ICU, and at the same time the other was not doing well. And it was a weird period because I didn't know what to feel. You know, when I felt happy about one side, I felt guilty about the other, and vice versa. So when I was feeling sad about Amaya, it seemed somehow wrong, because it was like, well, you know, I should be happy that, you know, we've had a healthy daughter, and vice versa. And it was a very weird time, and I don't think I ever really reconciled those two emotions. But it was hard. It was really hard. And I mean, I still look back at all of that time, I think, through a bit of a filter, because if I allow myself to really go back and feel the feelings from that time, you know, they're so raw. You know, I don't want to say I avoid them, but I prefer not to really drop back into those feelings most of the time, because they're really quite overwhelming. And I mean, for me, you know, people talk about time and distance. And I think for me, like, it's straight after the birth, and then the having to have Amaya basically die, you know, in our arms the day or so after she was born. The strong feelings were coming up like almost all the time. And I think over time what's happened is they're still there. It's not like they've gone away, but they surface less often. And so it's not that they're really dulled, it's that they're less present at the surface. And so it's less often that I feel them, I think would be the case. But I just remember feeling completely overwhelmed and wondering how I was ever going to survive at the time. That was the main sense, you know. Yeah. And I remember just sort of I remember at the time it was like being on autopilot. Like I was just threw myself into the stuff that had to get done. So, you know, there was things that had to happen to take care of stuff, you know, the funeral arrangements for Amaya, and making sure that, you know, because you were still in the hospital recovering from the birth, and, you know, we had Ananda Mae in the ICU in the humidity crib. And so I remember just throwing myself into doing all the things that needed to be done, and just keeping busy, because it was the only way I could really keep my head above water, and just do the next thing, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's odd looking back, because I still find it, I feel it very, it's very fractured. And I sort of have, and sometimes someone will mention something and I'll be like, oh yeah, you know, yeah, that did happen. Yeah, that's right. But it's all like a bit of a puzzle with the pieces all jumbled up on the board. And it takes a lot of effort to try and pull them back together. So what about you? What's the memories of that time?
It's fascinating to listen to you and to hear your perspective into that film or into that moment in time. And I specifically took some time this week to answer the questions prior to listening to you, in the sense to have a script in my head of what I remember without already being informed by what you remember. Because we know the story of someone else, the narrative actually makes already change into our narrative. But the first the picture that came up when I started to ask myself, so what do I remember? I remember the elation of finding out that they were twins. So we conceived the girls through IVF, and we've implanted one egg. And on the first ultrasound, I still remember the doctor saying, because I saw this picture and I had no idea of ultrasound, so I said, so what's that? Is that was a stick figure and like a mound. And I said, so this is the baby and this is the placenta, I said jokingly. And the doctor said, no, you have twins. And the first thing I said was, you must be joking. And then he was very seriously answering, I wouldn't be joking about something like that. And I was laughing, I think hysterically. I was so elated. And according to my sister, for example, she would say, well, you've always spoken about twins. And I was not aware of it at that time. But retrospectively, I remember a couple of incidences, like just when we were driving through the ultrasound, there were twins in school uniform. And I said, oh, look, that's what they would look like if they're twins. And you said, well, why don't you be grateful that we are actually pregnant? And another time when we went to the hospital and got us registered, and the label said BON, baby of Natalie. And I had a pair of shoes on and the brand was Bon Bon. And I said, oh, look, when they're twins, they're called Bon Bon. And so there are these little fragments that I have of joy. Overall, actually, I remember a lot of joyful, or I have a lot of joyful memories. The sort of next picture was the 19-week scan, when they were taking a lot of time, and it got to the point where I said, is something wrong? And then they said, well, yes, we see these cysts on the kidneys. And that's what that led into the understanding of the polycystic kidneys and so forth, which then started sort of the roller coaster. And I think that's sort of the first time I remember as being a shock that something wasn't entirely right, wasn't as it should be. And we started to Google what that meant, and were sent to the specialist. And sort of that's when I remembered the roller coaster of my, how do I deal with that? The shock sort of started to happen, the trauma. And in my case, simultaneously at that time, around 19 weeks, I also had the call of my father that said my mother just made a suicide attempt. So around the same time, which was quite confusing and obviously jumbled up the whole situation of being pregnant, and at the same time, my mother being in that state, in the hospital at that time. And then the next thing I remember was the 26-week scan, which sort of stood out, where that doctor that made the scan then took us into a room, I think, and said, and proceeded to say, you should consider terminating one of your twins because she's not viable. And I was in complete and utter shock. I think we both were, but I speak for myself at the moment. And I was like, I couldn't believe what he would say. And I mean, if you're in that space where you don't know much as a patient, and hearing that, I couldn't wrap my head around it. And luckily we had such good care from our gynecologist OB, and we had actually said to her that we would not consider termination unless it was medically required to do so for the livelihood of the girls, or one of the girls. And luckily she was there, and she wasn't there, but she would then step in afterwards and said, well, he wasn't in the place to actually say that. And I remember then we changed the ultrasound technician. We actually then took more responsibility over how they should address us, how they should address the girls as human beings, not as fetus, not as A or B or 1 and 2, but actually we gave them names. So there were specific things that came into motion as to say, okay, hold on, they are still very much alive, and this is how we're going to treat them. But I also remember the uncertainty and not being able to speak about it. I remember writing at that time Facebook notes instead of a blog, but I wrote things to people because I was still pregnant with twins, and people say, oh, you must be so elated. And I was not. I was here and there, and partly with my mother's situation. So I was very confused. Our gynecologist is called Suval Madre, Valley of the Mothers. So beautiful, such a beautiful name for an obstetrician. And she said, at some stage around week 30, she said, I believe that we should go to we can barely be sure that you can be pregnant until at least week 36, 37. And I was astonished because from what they had said before, and also that doctor that I mentioned before, he said, we know that twins should come out latest in week 34, 35 because of whatever he knew. But Sue Valmadre, she painted a different picture, and she was hopeful. And I think that really supported me. And then the next thing that I remember was, exactly 11 years ago on the 30th of August when we had another ultrasound. And then she said, okay, the amniotic fluid in Amaya's case was low. We should take them out. And then within 36 hours, they were born. What do I remember from the birth? I mean, for me, the birth is actually a magical place. It's interesting. I have recollections of the epidural, which was pain-free, astonishingly, with my history of needle phobias. And you did such a good job coaching me through that. I remember that you were sitting there and you were coaching me through that. And the guy who did the injection was also fascinating. And then, I just remember the beautiful support we had from Sue and the other lady and they were 2 doctors, 2 NICU nurses, 2 of everything. It was like 16 people in the room. And I remember them introducing them all to me, and that felt overwhelming to have such a crowd of people there. But then I also remember our obstetrician, so Sue, was putting the music on as we had made this birth plan as to, even in a C-section, we wanted certain things to happen, and then they walk out the baby as opposed to rip them out, and she did everything she could to follow our wishes. It seemed to me she was very supportive in that. And even after the birth, I remember the days afterwards, she came every day. And, to paint a picture, she was actually a doctor from another hospital, but because we were then transferred to the general hospital in Sydney, because that had also had a children's hospital attached to it, and because we were in this situation, they wanted us to be close to a children's hospital. And so then she, at some stage, after having already referred us to someone else, she said, let me deal with that. And she got her privileges, her papers to give birth to our girls. That really moves me. Yeah, just still to this day, that the care that she gave us and wanted to be there for us. Still to this day, this is very special. And then I think then it sort of comes very close to what you remembered of being just completely overwhelmed. And even just speaking, the picture that I have is like being an actress in a film and I'm waiting for it to stop. I remember it took days until I called my parents to let them know what happened. And I could not find words. And my sister was present. Maybe she's spoken to her parents, but I was like in a shock phase of the picture that I have is of me not moving. But I was moving. I was going down to the NICU. I was pumping breast milk and all of that. Yeah, and then the other significant moment is that night. So there was the second night after the birth where you were at home, and then there was this call on my phone, and I didn't pick it up because there was an undisclosed number. And then it called again, and so I thought, okay, I'll pick it up. And it was the NICU saying that Amaya had a prolapsed lung and I should come down. And so they brought me down to the NICU, and then, I don't know, they must have called you or something, and then you were on the way. And that's what sort of led into, for us to understand, or from what the doctor said and what we understood, or what I understood, is to say, for me, that was a sign from Amaya to say, I'm ready to leave, I'm ready to go. And yeah, but it was fascinating to have those two, and to hear your recollection of the NICU with all these sounds. Because the thing that I remember is, for example, the social worker walking up to me, and I didn't know she was a social worker. She was just dressed in normal clothes, and there were all these NICU nurses. She stood next to me and she started talking to me, and I was wondering, who's this person? She was so nice and she was helpful. And it turned out to be the social worker teaching us the steps to take. And then I remember Jo, who was the NICU nurse assigned to Amaya, and the way she took us through withdrawing care was just very, very gentle, very, very beautiful. So these are the things sort of I remember from the time before and then up to the time when she died. So how did you deal with your grief and loss early on? You mentioned before already that you sort of went into doing.
Yeah, I think that was my main strategy, to be honest, was just to do stuff. I think that was really my, if you like, my coping mechanism, was to throw myself into getting things done. Because like in action, doing nothing just meant that I would end up, just falling into the sadness and the grief, and then I felt paralyzed, and then it was like, it almost felt hopeless, and then so that's not a great place to be. And so the remedy to that, if you like, was just to do the next thing. Like, okay, what needs to be done? What do I need to do to look after Natalie? What do I need to do to, take care of anything to do with Amaya? What do I need to do for Ananda Mae? I mean, the thing is, because after the birth, you were all in the hospital. And so I probably spent, certainly in the early stage, I spent, a huge amount of time just in the intensive care unit. And I mean, if people have never been in one of these ICUs, it's unimaginable. You can't imagine what it's like. But, there's all these humidity cribs, and, obviously there's other, families there, or other parents there also with children in, either born very premature or very ill. And there's all these things going on, and there's all these machines beeping all the time. And it's, it's an incredibly stressful environment and a weird environment, and there's always things happening. You don't know what's going on, and there's people running. But I agree with you. I mean, I think the care that we got from the people, from Sue and from the nurses, and was just incredible. I mean, they were all so gentle and understanding, and I think that, that helped a lot. But yeah, but as I say, I think I just was just doing stuff. It was about the only thing I could, the only real choice I could make, I guess, was either to feel, to wallow in the grief, or to just try and move forward. And so it was just a matter of, okay, well, what can I do? And I think that stayed the case for quite a while. I mean, I remember even after we got home with Amaya, and, I remember just being really focused on, what needs to be done. How do we keep the environment relaxing and comfortable for you and for Ananda Mae? And, I remember, you were expressing breast milk, and then I was getting up in the night and, giving her bottles. It was just the whole period. I remember just doing stuff. I think that was really a lot of it. And I remember we had the music that we'd made around the birth, and that we just had that playing like 24 hours a day for a long time.
Yeah. 24/7. Yeah. I mean, for me, I remember the shock. I remember, as I said before, I was like, to me, it's like a big phase of shock. And in that, like walking around like a zombie. Now, I had also this split. I had this baby who I cared for. I mean, I did get up. But it was, the recollection is like a zombie. As you described it before, like this split between joy and grief, and not wanting to do wrong to either of those or either of the girls. I also remember that quite early on, we then went to a support group at a hospital for parents who lost their children postnatally, and that was really helpful for me to hear other people, because the thing that I hear all the time from clients is I feel alone, or I felt like no one else was like that, or I feel like I'm going crazy. And that has given me quite from the beginning an outlet or a place for me to be understood and heard, and also hear other people's stories and hear the similarities, feel like, okay, this is apparently normal given the circumstances. So quite early I was given the picture of, this is what it looks like, this is the face of grief, this is the situation of parents losing a child untimely just when they're born. And there was actually a family who had a girl in the exact same condition as we had with Potter syndrome. Now they had only one child. So to some degree as well, we were part of the group, but we actually had a baby. So I remember then the time when Michelle, my sister, left, we didn't go back to this group, but because we couldn't just have someone to look after the baby, because we had one, but we also grieved one. I then saw a therapist that I wanted to see, because I actually asked my GP for a recommendation, because I really felt I needed, as much as I had studied grief and loss and trauma, I for myself was clear enough, even though the shock, that I said, I need a sounding board. I need someone to tell me that I'm doing this right. Because I felt like I had no clue whether what I was doing was actually right. Not in the sense of doing it very well, but I had no feeling of, was this normal? Even though I said I had this group of parents that I saw, still within myself, there were things that I encountered in grieving that I had never ever before encountered. These strong emotions, these plethora of different things that you go through when you grieve. I don't have a previous experience of that. So I was quite clear that I needed someone to go to help me understand that process. And I was actually then my mother died from suicide on the 19th of January, so just 4.5 months after our daughter. And I wouldn't know what I would have done without her. And actually just on the day, I just called her and I said, I need an urgent session, because I was again thrown into something that I had no experience of. I also remembered the support that we got from friends and family, mainly my sister who was there. And I remember specifically the friends that were there at the hospital. And I think we were both there quite in shock. And I remember one specific friend, Tanya, she made a list of the things that we needed to do. And I remember another friend, Jancha, was there, and they didn't do much, but they were a picture of presence. They were just there holding us in that space where nothing that you can say actually can do anything to make it better, but just their presence, their loving presence. I didn't have to say much or do much, but it was just their loving presence there was just vital important for my soul. Was there a time when you didn't grieve, or where you couldn't or didn't want to?
No, I don't think that was ever. I always felt, we talked about it as well, but I wanted to grieve in the sense that I wanted to, there was no point where I regretted, having the twins, or, where I didn't want to feel the grief for Amaya, because for me that was, she was my daughter, and I felt the same amount of love and connection for her that I felt for Ananda Mae, and I didn't ever want that to go away. And I remember saying that to people that, I don't ever want to stop grieving her, because you don't want to forget the child. Right? So no, I don't remember a time when I ever didn't want to or couldn't grieve. I remember times when I didn't know how I was going to get through it. I just felt my heart was broken and I couldn't work out how to survive it. But there was never a time where I didn't want it, where I couldn't feel it. No.
So what resources or insight have helped you in those moments where your heart was so broken? You didn't go to a therapist, so you must have found other ways to support yourself.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I remember various things. I was doing sort of various NLP things and stuff to try and help me. But I've read some things that other fathers have written, and I've spoken to some other fathers, and I've read some books about fathers grieving, and it's something that I noticed was a thing that was commonly said by a lot of the fathers that I've spoken to or I've read about. The way that they dealt with the grief was by doing more. And I think that was really my strategy. So my strategy was to say, okay, I can't change what happened, so I'm going to focus on the things that I can influence, like the things that I can do. I'm going to do those as well as I can. And that was really sort of my response, is just to say, okay, what can I do? There's no point in me being useless. What can I do to make things better, easier or better for you? What can I do to make things better for Ananda Mae? How do I help and support? And the thing is, I've never been religious, nor even particularly spiritual. So it wasn't like I could, I didn't really have any, religious or spiritual practice to draw on. I think if anything, I felt, almost pushed away from anything spiritual, because I sort of felt like, look, if the universe would let something like this happen, then the universe was a cruel, unfair place. And, that didn't give me any comfort. But on the same token, there was no one that I could be angry with, because it wasn't anyone's fault. No one had done anything wrong. We hadn't done anything wrong. Amaya hadn't done anything wrong. I had no God to blame, because I don't believe in God, and so there's no point raging at the universe, because the universe doesn't care. So in a sense, for me, it was a little bit, maybe almost pushed me a little bit more towards the, okay, the universe doesn't care and isn't a fair place, and I can't do anything about that. So all I can do is, try to make the best of it, if that makes sense. It's a bit hard to explain, but I mean, I've certainly read or heard other fathers talking about similar things where, it seems to be perhaps a bit of a male response because of the way we, our upbringing or whatever, where we, we're sort of trained to be the provider or the support or the protector or whatever. But that was kind of, for me, how it felt. It was like, right, I have to do whatever I can to protect, my wife and the mother of my daughter and the daughter that's still there. I have to take care of them. And that was really that became the focus.
You say you're not very spiritual, but I think you're very switched on as to what you sense and your intuition. Because I remember around the death, there were certain things that you got access to, or knowledge that was presented to you inside of you, let's call it this way. And then that was actually confirmed by a medium. And I remember, and you can talk about that if you want, but for me, I remember that specific sentence that I said to you. In utter sadness, I also said, it seems strange, but suddenly everything seems right. And I couldn't make sense of that sentence, but the feeling that I had was that this course that this took was to some way, it was right. And it's difficult to explain because it doesn't make conscious sense. It only makes sense on a sensory level.
I mean, you say that. I do remember one thing, and, it's always hard to know because I think when you're in that sort of state, you're clutching for explanations or you're clutching for comfort. But I mean, I remember having a sense, and this sort of got reflected back from other places that, and not to try and make what happened, like not to excuse it, but having this strong sense that if that somehow that Amaya had come into the world to protect her sister and make sure that Ananda Mae could be born, and that was her role. That's how she came into the world, and it didn't really make any sense. But I had a real belief that was true, and as you say, we had sort of external feedback about that. But that was kind of a feeling. It was like an almost, a feeling that was her contribution, and that not to feel sad that she hadn't been able to survive because she had come into the world and achieved her goal.
This was completely confirmed by the medium that we, through that, got to know and became friends with, without, and I want to say, because Chris, you're not really the woo-woo type of person that has these intuitions and say, I can feel that. Not at all, but because when you have these kind of things, it comes from a source that is not something that you do all the time. So it's got some merit. I would give it some merit, definitely. And I mean, I wasn't in a space to have these kind of intuitions. That the only sentence that I said before was sort of there. How do you think our loss has shaped you? What has it done to your life, to who you are today? Well, let me rephrase that question, like, because I don't want to make it inactive. I want to make it active. Who have you chosen to become as part of that history that includes that loss of Amaya?
Well, I think something like this, like it's such a major life event that I think it just ripples throughout your whole life, and it impacts you in all sorts of different ways. So I think, and positive and negative. I think on one hand, I think I've become perhaps somewhat less trusting of. I always used to be a person that felt that things would work out. That was sort of my mantra. And, I think that got really bent out of shape. That, I don't feel like that anymore. I don't feel things are going to work out okay. That's not necessarily entirely negative because, I was probably looking bit through rose-colored glasses, and maybe a bit of dose of reality was a good thing. But I think it's made me a little bit more cynical or a bit less trusting.
I would say you were the optimist who became a realist, and I was a realist who became even more realist before.
But on the other side, I think it also made me a lot more understanding of, people who are going through a loss or grief. And I remember one thing that really shocked me was somewhere after when Amaya died, I remember seeing something about, I think it was like 1 in 4 parents, or 1 in 4 pregnancies, don't end up, terminate early. And I remember being really shocked and thinking, how can 25% of all pregnancies not end up the parents giving birth to a healthy child? And yet we never talk about it, right? Like that really shocked me. And I remember, I think I'm a lot more aware and sensitive of that now, to realizing that, we're so used to seeing, all this, excuse my French, but all this bullshit on, television where it's like, they're pregnant, it's so wonderful, and the baby's born, and everyone's great and happy. And it's like, okay, that's true, that happens. But, a quarter of the time it doesn't. And if you think about the number of pregnancies there are, that's a lot of pregnancies. That's a lot of people that are grieving, that are losing a child at some point in their life, often multiple. And yet we don't talk about it. And I think that's really tragic. And I think one of the things for me is I've become more aware of that. And, when I do know, I think a year or two ago, there was a family around that, where I remember the woman got pregnant, and then, just nothing got said. And I remember speaking to the husband and saying, what happened? And he said, we had a miscarriage. And I was like, look, I'm really sorry. And I think I'm better at sympathizing and understanding that now. Whereas in the past, I probably wouldn't have even noticed, let alone said anything. Yeah. So I think it's made me a lot more sensitive about those sort of topics. That's definitely been a change. And the other thing is, it's like you never, I don't think you ever forget. And there's lots of moments, obviously there's things like birthdays or the first day of school, or, there's all these moments where, I wonder what would have been like with Amaya. What would she have been like? How would she have been similar to Ananda Mae? How would she have been different? And seeing, we've got twins in the neighborhood, and seeing the twins go off to school together, it's hard, because it really emotionally, stabs you in the heart, right? And
activates. Yeah.
And recently we lost our 2 cats who've been with us for, a long time, 18 years or more. And, it's like that loss then comes to the surface, and then it sort of also reverberates with the previous loss. And it's a constant thing, it never goes away, and it often pops up in little moments, sometimes catches you unexpectedly. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, I wasn't thinking about this, and here it is. So yeah, and I think that'll happen all my life. There's going to be all sorts of key moments in Ananda Mae's life where I'll be wondering what would it have been like, the 2 of them, and what would Maya have been like? How would she have been? And I think that's natural, but it's it sort of tinges the experiences with a kind of a sadness, because you've always got that going on. And I think the thing is, that's not something that I share like often with other people. It's quite a private thing. So, I don't normally, I don't tend to find myself talking about it, but it's always there, and I had someone last year, a friend of mine asked me something like, how is it now? And I said, I said, I don't talk about it, but I said, I still think about Amaya almost every day. Right? I said, it might only be for a brief time, but I said, she's always present. And I think he was a bit shocked. He said, well, I didn't realize. And I said, yeah, well, I don't, it's not something I talk about.
And I think that's really important that you say that, because even for me, hearing that from you, it's good to hear it. And it's also a reality that for you, and I think that's the main difference between us, you're doing that more in a private sense for yourself. And I, through the course of what I have decided, or what came out of me through Amaya's loss, was this whole work that I'm doing got really skewed into grief and trauma. And this wouldn't have happened without the loss of Amaya and my mother. And I mean, the 6 books that I have written and authored and edited, they wouldn't have come out. It wasn't an intention to write a book in my life, but they came out of this. And there's good things that come out of this. But yeah, the main difference is for me, I mean, I choose to really authentically and openly look at what is happening each and every moment and really investigate into my grief in the last 11 years. And actually just yesterday I was asked, how is it for you now that you have Amaya? And you can always, because there was 2 lost parents who asked me, 2 lost mothers, is it heartbreaking or is it beautiful to have Ananda Mae and having a replica of her sister always present? And I answered, beautiful. It's beautiful. But that was not actually the full answer, because it's both. It's beautiful and it's heartbreaking. It's beautiful that I can see her and I can imagine them being identical twins. I can just imagine the second person, Amaya, here. And it's also always remember that, okay, it's not. And Ananda Mae herself has grieved her sister and is continuously grieving the presence of her sister. And I think the biggest heartbreak for me is the lack of understanding in society of that being a continuous topic, as you were beautifully expressing that. I think that's so important for people to understand that this is not something that goes away. It's just like my mother. She will always be my mother, and there's key moments that I miss her more, and then key moments where it's less present, but she's not going to go away because she's dead, or that part of her not being here present physically is a topic, the same way as for me, for you, for Ananda Mae, it's a topic that her sister is not growing up with her. And I guess that is really, I get a lot of fire out of that, of teaching society to change the narrative around the getting over grief or becoming better or saying goodbye, leaving it behind, all these notions that we have, or these myths that we have heard and grown up with and are portrayed by the media and by television series and so forth. But I'm going to leave that high horse now. Last question, maybe. Let's have a look at, we're looking back to 11 years. How do you think your grief and your loss and your grieving has changed? I mean, you mentioned a little bit how it is still every day. And how has it developed in those 11 years?
Well, I think that the main thing I would say is that, like, at the beginning, as I described, it was, it felt overwhelming. And, that's absolutely changed. So, when it does come up, it no longer has that sense of being overwhelming or, and I think I've integrated it in the sense that, it's now something that, like, there was a sense of disbelief, at the beginning. There was a sense of disbelief. This can't be happening. How can this be happening? How am I ever going to get past this? Whereas, now it's something that happened. There's a sadness, but also, as I said, there's also some, if you like, appreciation of it. Because I do believe, regardless of whether it's true, I do believe that there was some reason for Amaya to come into the world, and that it wasn't pointless. But it's just much less. It's no longer like a flood of emotion that is drowning, and it's there. It sometimes catches in my throat, or brings me to tears. But it's if you like, it's manageable, right? It doesn't overwhelm me. It doesn't feel like, oh God, I can't go on. How can I cope? It's more a matter of, yes, that's something that happened, and it's always going to be with me. And as I said again, I'm sad that she's not still with us. I'm not sad that she came into the world and that we got to know her, even if for a brief period of time. So I think that's the main difference, and it probably comes up. It comes up less spontaneously. So it tends to be more something that I'm reminded by something little, rather than it just being there all the time. Oh my God, am I dead? And how could this happen? It's terrible. It's more like, I wonder what that would be like with Amaya. Or, I was sitting here this morning with Ananda Mae doing some math homework with her, and, I was thinking, because it's right around, obviously, the anniversary of Amaya's death. So it's very present, and I knew we were going to be doing this podcast, so it was sort of on my mind, and I was thinking, I wonder what this would have been like with the two of them, and how different they would have been, whether one would be tutoring the other now, or, it's like those are the things that you wonder how would that have been. And then, she was getting frustrated brushing her hair, and I didn't say anything to her at the time because she was already having a meltdown. But I was thinking, if there were the two of them, they could have brushed one another's hair, and that would have been really, really lovely. So there's those things come up. It's more that.
Yeah, and we obviously have those picture perfect moments of siblings, right?
Exactly.
Like them brushing their hair, but we don't usually think, no, they would be fighting and giving each other hell. I mean, even Ananda Mae says, if I had a Maya, she would be coming to school with me. Yeah, but that's the nice thing, that you picture and not the others. And we were actually, just before we were starting, we were discussing her having the meltdown, and my sense is that she herself has this remembrance in her body, like it happens with me. There's usually around the week before things start to happen. And actually this year, if I look back this year, I'm always sensitive in terms of waiting. Okay, what's gonna come up without expecting? But I mean, I know it's the birthday because I'm planning a birthday for Ananda Mae, so I can't really avoid it. And that's the birthday, and then the death anniversary is 2 days later. This time it was very gentle. And as I said, I took time on the stand-up paddle to rehearse or to plan that, but I wasn't taken by grief. And I think it's really good to see for other people the testament of time of 11 years. And I actually am glad I actually written different articles through the years. And I have one article where I summarize all of them and link them, which I'm going to link in the show notes, which shows the difference. Because one of the things that I see that has really helped me, so the first book was written in the second year of grief. And if I just already look at the development from the second to the third year, and I can really look at that precisely because in the third year I was translating it into German. And when I translated it, I did a literal translation. And even with that translation, I was wondering, I wouldn't say it like that now. So a year later had already changed so much in my narrative that I wouldn't have said it exactly the same way. And I think that's why also this book, Grieving Parents, Surviving Loss as a Couple, is a good book for early grievers because it reflects that time. I've spoken to so many parents as part of the book who were early on in their grief. And now I'm 11 years out and I speak my narrative has changed. I tell a different story. As you were saying, I sometimes think, okay, what if I had two? And Ananda Mae is quite vivacious and passionate. So I sometimes think, oh my God, if there were two like that, yeah, there's a longing or a sadness with that. And I think that's, for me, that's the symbol of the love that we have, given that we have two. And, the one sentence that I remember someone saying to my father, well, at least she has one and she's healthy, which is absolutely true. And yet it's emotionally barren for someone expecting to just have one.
Yeah. I mean, you can't. It's not a trade-off.
Yeah. Yeah. And that part, I'm glad that my father actually learned that part because he said to that woman, so you have 3 children. Which one would you let go of? Because you already have 3, you can still have 2. So he was giving her exactly that statement to say, well, you can't just give up one because you have others. Doesn't work with children, maybe works with cars or bicycles if you have many, but shall we finish with the rapid fire question? So the first one is, grieving and trauma means, to me it means life. It's part of life. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's a natural response to things that happen to us.
And healing means?
Well, for me, I think it's as I said, it's integrating the events and the feelings into who you are, so that in time they become less overwhelming. They don't go away; they just become less. They become less overwhelming and less present in day to day.
I think that's a beautiful sentence. What I came up as a first thing was to make a distinction between healing and healed. Healing is an ongoing process. I think that's important to hear. It's the ongoing dealing, processing with what has happened without an end point in mind. With grief and trauma, I don't see an end point, and I don't think that's the point of it. The next one is what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma. I think for me it is that I have more resilience than I might know in that moment.
Yeah, I was trying to find the right word. And I think for me, I surprised myself with the fact that I was able to deal with that the way that I did and get on and get things done, that it didn't overwhelm me to the point where I couldn't function. I think that surprised me that I had that level of strength.
One thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma.
I said that it doesn't go away. This idea that, it gets like that you're going to forget or it gets better over time isn't really true. It's always there and it's always present. It gets better in the sense that, at least for me, that it becomes more integrated in who you are. But I think it's a fallacy to think that that 11 years down the track that you don't, it's not there anymore, because it's always there.
I would echo your words. I would say loss and trauma are states that are part of our story. Like I'm a mother, that doesn't change when my child is dead, or I'm a daughter, doesn't change because my mother is dead. That's a state that remains. It's not a process. And yes, it's also part of life. One specific thing that has changed since my loss or our loss and trauma that we wouldn't want to miss?
Well, I mean, the fact that we had twin girls, the fact that Amaya passed doesn't change that fact. I mean, I'm still the father of twins. We still had the whole experience, which was amazing. And as you said, there were plenty of aspects of it that were just incredible. And of course, I have Ananda Mae, who's there every day as like a reminder, and also a joy.
For me, I wouldn't want to miss all the good things that came out of me dealing with that loss and trauma. The things that happened, for example, the books that I came to write, or the people that I spoke to, the understandings that I got, or the not sympathy, but the empathy with people going through hard times, that every person has a story. Even what you just shared, that I might not see what's going on under the surface because that person is more private with that story. That sensitivity, to have that I wouldn't want to miss. I wonder what Ananda Mae would say all about that. Maybe one day I'll have a podcast, with her, because her grieving story or her grieving development is quite interesting as well. I mean, I could tell a story about how I see it, but then it would be interesting for her to say that maybe when she's a bit older. So thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time. It's been beautiful taking that time in honor. And I see this time that we're doing this as parenting Amaya, of spending time with Amaya, of giving her credit of what she means in our life.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.